Yes, well, my name is Benjamin Bagby, and I'm a singer and harpist and medievalist, by training a musician. And I've always been interested in medieval music since my teenage years and was always pursuing access to medieval music as a kid and as a student, which inevitably led me to Europe, of course. I came from the Midwest in the US, and I ended up in Basel at the Schola Cantorum Basiliensis, which was in those days, really prehistoric times, um, about the only place you could go to study such music. And while I was there, I met a lot of people who became my colleagues later, and my life partner, Barbara Thornton, was also there, and we were working together with a group of teachers who were from an intact ensemble that was in residence, Thomas Binkley and Andrea von Rahm and people like that. And after finishing a diploma there, we went to Germany to live as freelance musicians, and we started our ensemble called Sequentia, which has been around now for 47 years. And as I learned and performed more music over those many years, and touring and recording, and we were very much involved with Hildegard von Bingen in the 80s and 90s, I started to just teach myself so much about this music that I couldn't learn in school, that I began finding it necessary to pass it on to the next generation. And I began teaching, as did my colleagues. And one of the most important places we taught was Vancouver, at the summer course for early music, which was a 2-week intensive summer course that was unlike anything in the world. And the people who came to that course were brilliant, and we had the most wonderful experiences with really fine musicians. And so Vancouver kind of became the definition of the ideal way to study something and learn it. And that went on for many, many years. We were incredibly blessed to have a lot of support, especially from Jose Verstappen, legendary figure in Vancouver early music. And that led then later to my teaching activities I taught at the Sorbonne in Paris for 13 years in the newly created medieval music program there, master's degree. And after that, I'm now teaching I'm in my last year at the University of Folkwang in Essen, Germany, where there's another medieval music and Gregorian chant course, also for a master's diploma. And I'm kind of easing out of the performing slowly, because I'm trying to give the younger generations something meaningful to step into and take over and give it new energy and push it in new directions. And I think that's just great. Those are loaded questions. The Gregorius story is quite complex. I've tried to craft an elevator pitch to tell the story in 1 minute or less. It's simply not doable. But let me just say it's about sin and redemption, largely written, but with using the sin is incest. And it's not incest one time between brother and sister, it's incest twice. Brother and sister that produce a baby, which later marries his mother. So it's a little bit the Oedipus story, but it has all kinds of other shadings, and it's about faith and reconciliation and the nature of love and the nature of redemption and the nature of penitence, which was a big topic for medieval listeners. And without going into details about the plot, because it's a real twisty plot, it goes on all kinds of tangents and is quite dark sometimes, with little humorous moments. I would just say that it follows one man who has been set adrift on the ocean as a baby with a little ivory tablet inscribed on which is the fact that he's nobly born, but the product of incest, and with a lot of gold coins and a beautiful silken cloth to prove that he's a noble baby. And he survives this trip on the sea and is found by fishermen who turn him over to the abbot of a monastery, where he's raised up. And he's, of course, a brilliant student and the best monk ever, and he's going to become, obviously, the next abbot. But something about him is gnawing at him. He has a sense that he doesn't really know who he is or where he comes from. And he is finally told when he's a teenager that he's a foundling, and he's not actually the son of the fisherman's family that had raised him. And then he's crazy. Then he reveals to the abbot that all this time when he was studying and being a brilliant student, what he was really doing was dreaming about being a knight and fighting and riding horses and jousting and defeating everyone else. And he wants to be released from his vows and go off and seek his fortune as a knight. And after much discussion, he's allowed to leave. And he's looking for a place where he can make a difference, where he can save somebody. And the person he ends up saving is his own mother, who has vowed never to marry after setting this baby on the sea. And she's being pursued by wealthy suitors, and she refuses them all. And the most tenacious of the suitors is now making war on her to force her to marry him. And along comes this young man with all of his enthusiasm and not very much skill, but he starts a training regimen and he trains himself to be a knight, and he single-handedly defeats this knight who came to take away his mother. And of course, her people say, this boy is great, and you know what? You need to get married because we don't have an heir. And we're going to have problems with other men later on if you don't marry somebody. And so she agrees to marry him. And they're quite happily married, actually, for some time. Although there's a difference in their age. You know, she's probably in her mid-30s, mid to late 30s, and he's probably a teenager. So that's a little bit racy. And then through a whole series of things that I won't go into here, it's discovered that he is indeed her son. Yeah. It's really heart-wrenching. And then they agree that they have to part, and they agree that she's going to stay in her kingdom, and she's going to do penance and give alms to the poor and take care of the sick and wash the lepers and do everything she can possibly do to redeem herself. And he's going to go off and be a hermit and wait for redemption and pray and hopefully die. And he finds a sadistic fisherman who agrees to take him to a little rock in the middle of the ocean and deposit him there with leg irons attached with a key. And so he's locked up on this stone, and he stays on this stone for 17 years. Back in Rome, the Pope has died, and they're looking for a new Pope, and they can't agree because, as the Romans always do, they disagree about everything. And two bishops are each given a vision that the next Pope will be found sitting on a rock in Aquitaine. And they go off in search of him. And long story short, they find him. He doesn't believe them. He thinks they're demons sent to torture him. And he finally agrees when the fisherman is brought, and the fisherman has the key that he had used to lock him up, which had been eaten by a fish. And that very morning, the fisherman caught the fish, and in cleaning it, the key fell out, and he realized what was going on. So that's divine intervention like crazy. And he agrees to go with them back to Rome, where he becomes the greatest pope ever. He's very mild and forgiving, and people find solace in him, and they find wisdom in him, and he's generous, and he's kind, and he's gentle, and everyone agrees this is the best pope we've ever seen. And the news travels far and wide, and it reaches his mother, who says, maybe this wonderful new pope can release me from my sin. So she goes to Rome and confesses to him. He realizes who it is, and they're reunited. This time as son and mother, not as husband and wife. And they live out their years in Rome, in piety and happiness. And the moral of the story is, there's no sin so horrible that it can't be forgiven. There's only one sin that can never be forgiven, and that's the sin of despair. and neither of them ever despaired. They kept their faith throughout the whole ordeal. So that's a really short version of a very complex story. This story probably existed in various forms throughout the Middle Ages, but it was written down for the first time in France, actually, in French, at a time when there was a big vogue for writing saints' lives and stories of saints' miracles. And so it was called the story of Saint Gregory, or the Pope Gregory. And it's not the Pope Gregory who invented chant. It's a fictitious Pope Gregory. And a very successful and interesting young avant-garde poet in Germany knew this French version, and he decided to rewrite it in German, or reconceive it in German. And this guy's name was Hartmann von Aue, living somewhere in the southwest of what is now Germany. We don't really know exactly where or even exactly when, but it was roughly in the 1190s. So he was active at a time just at the end of the life of Hildegard von Bingen. They were almost contemporary. So that's this extremely vital and culturally dynamic 12th century. And he created this piece at some time around 1200, and it's attested in a variety of manuscripts. But the question that so interested us is that it wasn't created as literature to be read from a book. It was obviously coming from a storytelling tradition. And how might that have sounded? When nobles got together of an evening to listen to a great story, well, how was that done? Because, I mean, we have our techniques and our technical possibilities and our digital technology for allowing us to experience stories very vividly. But they, of course, had only words, but they also had the human voice. And instruments. So we're interested in how voices and instruments might be brought together in a synergy to retell a story in a way that could keep people glued to their screens over many, many evenings. I think it would take about 6 to 8 evenings to tell the whole story properly. So we had the task of boiling it down to about 100 minutes maximum. And that's what we're working on right now. Well, I had first read the story in a very remarkable way. It's been repeated many times over the centuries. It was a popular story. There's even a version in Yiddish. And the version that I first encountered in my life was a novel written in 1952 by Thomas Mann, the author of Magic Mountain and Dr. Faustus and all these wonderful novels. His last work was called The Chosen One, or The Holy Sinner. It's not called Gregorius. And that's when I first read it. And he changes everything. He puts it in a different place at a different time, and he adds all kinds of characters to it. But that's okay. That's where I first knew it, and it had intrigued me then. And then when I was discussing this with the singers, I realized that it's something that's been in the back of my mind for a long, long time. And it was actually Yasmina who said something about, wouldn't it be great to perform the original Gregorius of Hartmann von Aue with readings from Thomas Mann interspersed between them. So the original idea was to combine the Thomas Mann with but that we were immediately in a 12-hour show, so there's no way that could be done. So unfortunately, we had to drop the Thomas Mann idea, but that kind of got everybody excited. And once we had made a decision about how we're going to access melody and melodic materials and modal materials for this particular story, it made suddenly a lot of sense. It's a mix. There are no musical sources for this text, and we wouldn't expect to find any. Nobody would have thought to write down musical notation for such a thing. But if it was sung, Clearly, it was sung according to some kind of storytelling models, which are by their nature modal. And so I went fishing in all of the German sources for melody from that time and slightly thereafter, which give us modal information and modal figures, and did a lot of deconstructing and creating of modal gestures that we can use to tell the story. So in many places, as the story is just unwinding, the storyteller is using a model to speak the text. In other places, like a lament or a specific event that has a beginning and an end, there might be an actual melody, which is something we could call a song. And maybe that would be learned in advance and performed as a piece of music inserted into the drama. So it's a little bit like my work with the Beowulf epic, which is, of course, from 200, 300 years before, but it has a lot of the same principles for oral transmission of stories in the Middle Ages. Well, I think the similarity is that there's nothing fake. There's nothing kind of Renaissance fair about it. You know, we're not saying, let's all pretend that we're medieval. And it's just an honest, like, here are three human beings wearing neutral clothing and not trying to be anything. And they're going to sit down and go into a story, and they're going to tell it in some detail. And they're going to incorporate the roles with their voices, maybe with gesture, and mostly with their voices. And I think that honest quality, it allows the audience to say, okay, I don't have to worry about all this fake stuff. I can just concentrate on what's going on with the human level, because that's what interested the medieval listener. I mean, it's not for nothing that these stories from the Middle Ages are usually about unusual people who are unusually smart, unusually good looking, unusually rich, unusually endowed in one way or another. And they sort of give us aspirational figures that we can think, I wish I could be like that. Myself, I'm singing and speaking and playing harp. And then my two colleagues, there's Jasmina Černcic, mezzo-soprano from Slovenia, who's singing the role of the mother, wife, all the female roles, and playing harp. And then there's a tenor named Lukas Papenfuß-Klein, who's from Brooklyn, and he's singing all the parts of Gregorius. And the instruments are simply two Gothic or Romanesque harps of identical build and type, and they are each played by one of the three singers. Oh, the audience, always the audience. This is a wonderful, wonderful audience, which is curious and motivated and loyal. And it was so great, since we came so many years in a row, it was so great to see the same people and watch them kind of get old with us over the period, and watch new people come in. And it was the feeling of community.